All right, for our next video in the series of how markets work, we'll look at prices and how demand and supply get combined to come up with prices. So we have the concept of equilibrium price, which means that quantity demanded in a market, people demanding goods equals quantity supplied. So in a market, if we have equilibrium price, that means that consumers and producers have agreed on demanding as many goods at a price as suppliers are willing to produce. So if we look at how this works in a market and we look at some examples, we can look at Apple watches. So we see here we have our another schedule. We have our prices shown in this schedule of all these different prices at Apple watches. We have the how much people might be willing to demand Apple watches at those prices, and we see the law of demand in effect, right? That at low prices, there is a lot of demand, and at high prices, there's less demand. So people demand less of a good as prices go up. And in the supply schedule, we see that at low prices, nobody wants to produce an Apple Watch because it's not worth the time and money. But at high prices, a lot of people want to, well, let's say in this case, supply Apple Watches, not produce them, like to sell them at a retail store. A lot of people want to supply them at a high price because there's a lot of money to be made. So we'll graph these and we'll look at it in blue and white, which is great because it feels like Star Wars and lightsabers battling it out as these lines cross. All right, so we got blue and red lines crisscrossing at the equilibrium price. And we'll look at this, we'll actually graph these out in a more precise manner than that. But we can look at, if we graph demand first, we know that at, $100, 1,200 people will demand Apple Watches because it's a really good deal. Even if you don't want an Apple Watch, you say, well, it's $100. I'll give it away as a gift. I don't want to wear one, but it's a steal at that price. So 1,200 people want to buy one at $100. At $200, 900 people want to buy one. At $300, 600 people want to buy one. And at $400, 450 people want to buy one. So that would be roughly about here. And at $500, 250 people want to buy one, roughly about there. And at $600, 225 people want to buy one. So, be up here. So we have a demand curve sloping downward to the right as we have studied before. And if we looked at supply, we would say at $100, nobody wants to produce them because maybe they don't make, or they don't want to supply them. They don't want to sell them because it wouldn't be worth the shelf space and hiring employees to sell them and all the other stuff. At $200, then 200 people would supply them. And at $300, 350 people would want to supply them. At $400, 450 people would want to supply them. At $500, then 550 up to here, and at $600, 650. So it'd be roughly about there. So we have a supply line going upward to the right as we've studied before, and you can see on this schedule here, if you were taking note, demand and supply have agreed at $400. 400 people want to supply Apple Watches at $400, and 450 people want to buy them. There's agreement there. That's our equilibrium price, and it's shown on the graph where these 2 points intersect, and we call that the equilibrium price. We can label that, put that here, draw that dot there. This would be price. That's our price. So I put price 1. We'll eventually in a later video see price and demand and supply change and how that changes prices. But there's our equilibrium price, right? The market has agreed at $400 that there would be as many people willing to buy the watches as there are people willing to supply this. This is in effect, right? Adam Smith, we've studied before. Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand. We don't need the government to tell the market how much to sell watches for. We don't need anybody else to do that. Consumers and suppliers will agree at a price at what watches will cost. And the reason you can think about this, how this comes to be, like they don't just, I guess they don't automatically come to this. It's some trial and error. If we were to look at this and say, okay, what would happen if, let me change colors here, go to yellow. If we were to say that price for Apple Watches were $500. So we draw a little line here where $500 would be. We say, well, how many watches would suppliers be willing to make at $500? So we could look at this and we could say at, let's see, $500, we know suppliers were willing to supply 550 watches. It shows that over here, if you remember in our schedule over there, right? So we have 550 watches, and at $500, consumers are only willing to buy 250 watches. So that'll be right here. So if they were to try to sell Apple Watches for $550, we'd have more people supplying them sitting on shelves than we would have people buying them. We'd have a difference of, this would be a surplus, right? There'd be more watches supplied. There'd be 550 watches supplied and only 250 people buying them. So we'd have a surplus of 300 watches just sitting there on the shelves. And that could be shown in the graph if you ever want to show a surplus, right? We have our price here of $500. And our equilibrium price is down here at $400. So everything above equilibrium price would show a surplus. If we tried to sell watches at $550, we'd have extra watches sitting on the shelf, 300 extra watches, and there'd be a surplus. So how do suppliers solve that problem of a surplus? They have to drop their price, right? Because they already have the watches there sitting there. They would drop their price, and maybe they experiment. They say, okay, what happens if we drop it to $450? We still have a surplus. What happens if we drop it to $425? We still have a surplus. Eventually, they would get to the point of $400, and they would be putting as many watches on the shelf as people are coming in to buy them, and they would be happy. So, how does that work? That's the invisible hand, right? It's trial and error. You try different prices, see if you have too many watches or not enough, and then when people seem happy with the prices, then as many people buying them as you are willing to supply them, you've reached equilibrium, right? So that's where we want to get to in the market. We want to get to equilibrium. So this would be our equilibrium price. So when markets are in disequilibrium, if prices are too high, then they will eventually shift down. The price will shift downward until they get to the point of equilibrium. We look at another example here of beets. Beets. So we have the demand for beets. We can graph and say at $6 for a beet. Nobody wants to buy a beet. So $6. Let's see, $6 here. Nobody's buying a beet. At $5, one person might buy a beet. And at $4, two people might buy a beet. And at $3 per beet, it might jump up to 5 people buying a beet. And at $2 per beets, it might jump up to 8. And at $1 a beet, people would buy more beets. So we have our downward shifting to the right demand line, right? So as our demand for beets. And if we're going to look at supply of beets, we would say, okay, well, at $1, nobody really producers aren't going to grow that many beets. So we might only have one beet produced or supplied. We could think of this in the supply to store. We only supply one beet for $1. And at $2, we would jump up to 3 beets. And at $3, we would jump up to 6 beets. And at $4, we would jump up to 9 beets. And at $5, we would jump up to, let's see, what I said, 12 beets. And at $6, we'll supply lots of beets out there because that's a huge amount of profit. We'll supply lots of beets, and we'd have a supply line going upward to the right. So we look at this, and this one is a little bit different because we can't tell by looking at this graph exactly where equilibrium is because it's not like the previous one that had it right there for us. There's no numbers here that entirely agree. So we look at this and say, okay, where is our equilibrium price? They seem to meet right about here. So that would be, it looks like maybe just a little bit above 250, right? So we'll call it even. We'll call it $2.50. Let's imagine that's on the line. $2.50 is the equilibrium because at that price, approximately, 5.7 people want to buy a beet at $2.50, and suppliers are willing to supply 5.7 beets at $2.50. So the market would be at equilibrium at that price. So you think about, and then in the last example, we looked at what would happen with a surplus. So let's imagine what would happen if there was more demand for beets. Let's say the price was too low. Let's say they set the price at $1.50. So let's draw this line over here at $1.50. Let's say we were to charge $1.50 for beets. There would be more people demanding beets at $1.50. So that would be, looks like 9 people would demand beets, but suppliers would only be willing to supply 2 beets at $1.50. So we'd have a shortage, right? There wouldn't be enough beets on the market. We'd have a shortage of 7 beets. And we would show that by shading in this area. This is where our shortage would be because our equilibrium price is at 250. So maybe at the beginning of this, as we start selling beets, we don't know that's equilibrium price. So what we do is we drop our prices. We raise our prices. We don't have enough beets. People, they're flying off the shelves. So we want to slow that down because we can't produce any more beets. Take too long to farm them. So we want to be able to reach equilibrium. So maybe we raise our price from $1.50 to $2, and now we're still in a shortage area, right? We can't keep beets on the shelf. And maybe we raise our price to $2.25, and we can't keep beets on the shelf. And eventually we get to the point of $2.50, where we're willing to put as many beets on the shelf as there are people willing to buy them, and we reach equilibrium. So this is what's great about a free market economy, is that it's efficient and it works on its own. You don't need regulations. Prices will adjust so that as many people are happy buying beets as there are selling them, right? If the price gets too high, if the price gets up in this area, then people aren't going to buy beets. They'll buy something else, right? They don't have to have beets. They can buy something else to replace those beets. Equilibrium is where we want to get in a free market. If we look at some examples, a couple quick examples of where the government could intervene and what that might look like and how it might affect it, we could say, look at the example of toilet paper, right? So that's a big thing that was missing off the shelves and still doesn't really seem to have rebounded the way it was before the pandemic. But we look at toilet paper. If we're going to graph this out, that's $7. This is in thousands of people down here, right? So in $7, 5,000 people would buy a pack of toilet paper, and at $6, 10,000 people would buy a pack of toilet paper. At $5, it would go to, I'm going to go on the lines right here. I think I missed a line. Let's fix that. At 10, we'd be at 6. There we go. And at $5, 15,000 people would buy it. At where are we at? $4, we'd be up to 20,000. And at $3, 25,000. So we'd have a demand line sloping down right for the demand for toilet paper. And if we were to draw a supply in here, we could say, okay, at $3, there would be only 5 suppliers that would only be willing to supply 5,000 packs of toilet paper because they wouldn't be making that much money off of it. And at $4, they might be willing to supply 10,000. At $5, they'd be willing to supply 15. And at $6, they'd be willing to supply 20. And so we have our supply line going upward to the right supply. And in this case, our equilibrium price is right here. Our equilibrium price is $5. Let's say for some reason the government were to say that's too much, that's unfair prices for people that have to pay for toilet paper. The consumer can't afford $5 for a pack of toilet paper. So they were to impose a price floor. Think about a price floor. Let's put that up here. Price floor prevents prices from dropping below a certain point. I'm sorry, my mistake. I'm thinking ahead to the next example. We're going to talk about a price ceiling. So a price ceiling prevents prices from rising to a certain point. In a sense, it puts a cap on prices. So we're going to put a price ceiling on here. And we'll put that in yellow. If the government were going to say, look, $5 is outrageous for a pack of toilet paper, we want to set a price ceiling at $3.50. So the government would have put a ceiling down. And it could be kind of confusing because it's below the equilibrium price, and people might associate that with being a floor. But a price ceiling is preventing prices from going up. So, spelled ceiling wrong. Good heavens. Ceiling. There we go. A price ceiling will prevent prices. Prices want to go up to equilibrium, where they would meet at $5, but the government says that's too much for toilet paper. It's a necessity. We're going to create a price ceiling here at $3.50. So even if producers want to sell toilet paper for more than $3.50, the government would say you can't. What we would end up with is we see if the price is below equilibrium, we would end up with a shortage of toilet paper. This whole area below equilibrium shows a shortage. So price ceilings, you might say that's good because you want to keep prices low, but what would end up happening, there would be less toilet paper on those shelves because suppliers, people supplying them, say, well, I can't make enough money at $3.50 to make it worth either producing or supplying toilet paper, so we'll just produce and supply less. There'll be less toilet paper because producers don't only want to supply At that point, looks like about maybe $7 or 7,000 pieces of toilet paper, but consumers would demand at 350 over 20,000 rolls of toilet paper. So there'd be a shortage there. So price ceilings can be good if it's a necessity, but it also can create a shortage. So price ceilings often create shortages. And they gave the example in the book of rent control. If we were to put a price ceiling on rent, it would be good because your rent would stay low, but then people would stop offering apartments. They would turn the apartments into something else, office space, or they just would not maintain them, whatever it might be. Because price ceilings hurt suppliers, so they'd have less of an incentive to supply whatever the good is. If there was a price ceiling, that prevented prices from getting to the equilibrium point, right, where everybody's happy. If we're to look at labor, labor is another example. We can use this to look at price floors. So let's keep it at yellow. Price floors. So if we were going to graph out our labor, so we're talking about how many workers in a market are willing to supply their labor to employees. And this can be kind of confusing because when we think about demand, we often think of consumers, right? But in this case, who demands labor? Not the workers, the employers, right? So this would be the employers, and who supplies the labor is the workers, right? So we can maybe make a little note down here. This is the employers, and this is the workers. They are supplying their labor for jobs. So if we were going to graph this out at $4 an hour, I'd be willing to hire a lot of workers. So quantity demanded would be 100 at $4 a worker. I'd be willing to hire a lot of workers at $4 an hour because that's not a lot of money. If we were talking about paying people $5 an hour, that would drop. I'd be willing to employ less because now I'm going to spend more of the money and make less profits. If I were going to if the price of workers are going to go up $7, I would demand less. So that would be roughly about here. And if the price of labor was going to go up to $8, I would just only demand 30 workers. And if the price of labor to go up $9, I would only demand, looks like 20 workers. And at $10, I wouldn't demand any workers, right? So this is the law of demand, and it sounds weird because we're talking about now, we're employers, and you think about suppliers and employers. But if I demand your work, I don't want to pay more for workers than I have to, so I'll demand less workers at higher prices. The same thing as you demand less goods at higher prices. If we look at supply of workers, people looking to offer their work at $4 an hour, we're going to have almost nobody want to work because it's a terrible wage. And at $5 an hour, still don't have a ton, so we'd just barely be here. And at $6 an hour, we'd be up to 20 workers. At $7 an hour, we're getting closer to what we consider minimum wage, right? So that might be, it looks like 40 workers. We're around here. And at $8 an hour, we'd be at 60 workers. $9 an hour would be at 90 workers. And at $10 an hour at 120 workers, so right about there. So we'd have a supply line looking something like this, right? This shows how many workers would be willing to take a job at these different wages. And we see here we have an equilibrium price that looks, or equilibrium wage at about $7 an hour, right? This would be equilibrium. There'd be as many jobs available at $7 an hour as there would be workers willing to work for $7 an hour. If the government were to set a price floor, that would be minimum wage. Let's say the government were to say, we're going to make a minimum wage $9. This would be a price floor of minimum wage. At $9 an hour. So if the government were to raise minimum wage, then they may have what we call a surplus of labor, right? So you think about at $9 an hour, more workers would be willing to work, right? We'd have all these, if we're thinking about supply of workers, we'd have workers that would be willing to, we'd have 100 workers willing to take a job for $9 an hour. However, people demanding the labor, employers, don't want to hire that many workers at $9 an hour because that would mean they spend more money. So they'd only be demanding 20. So we'd have a surplus. When we think a surplus of labor, we'd have 80 more workers than we would jobs. There'd be a surplus of labor. There'd be a lot more people out of work in that sense because people don't want to hire them. And we show a surplus by looking at this line, this area above equilibrium price. Now, we'll talk more about minimum wage and the pros and cons of raising it. There may be, there's certainly arguments to do this anyway. So I'm just using this as an example. I'm not saying minimum wage is good or bad, but you can think just purely in supply and demand terms. We would have a surplus of workers. There'd be too many workers. And how do we get rid of some of those workers? In the sense, when we say get rid of them, give them jobs, we'd have to start lowering the wages, right? So some of these people would stop looking for jobs. Stop being on the market. So we'd lower the wage $8, and we'd have this many people looking for jobs, lower it to, $7.50. If we eventually got down to $7, where we were at equilibrium, there would be as many people looking for jobs as there were people demanding those jobs. And this might be in various fields. Like, this wouldn't be workers overall. So let's say this is for like working at like a fast food restaurant, at a drive-through window. Well, a lot of these people that were looking for a drive-through window job would go and seek other jobs because the wage, is too low. So we eventually get to equilibrium. So we can look at price floors in general, right? Price floors usually cause surpluses. And if you have and sometimes that's okay, right? Sometimes, it depends on what you're looking at, but generally speaking, in economic terms, but a surplus, and surpluses usually drive prices lower. But if you have a price floor, then you can't drive the prices lower, so with a surplus of workers. So that's where we'll end this video. There'll be another video coming about what happens when all these things, when we have supply and demand combined, and we have some of those shifters of demand and supply impacting how those change. So that'll be the last video in this series.